Talking of things that are infuriating, former British Prime Minister Tony Blair has joined a White House meeting with US President Donald Trump to discuss plans for a post-war Gaza. Blair, who served, of course, as Middle East envoy after leaving office in 2007, focused on boosting Palestinian economic development and creating conditions for a two-state solution. The US Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff said Washington is preparing for a very comprehensive plan for the next day after the conflict, though a few details so far have been revealed. Joining me now, Michael Graham, our man on the Hill, US political commentator, managing editor of Inside Sources, with his ear firmly to the ground on these matters. Michael, good afternoon to you. Look, I don't need to explain much about Tony Blair to you. He's a global figure. But the nearest analogy I came up with is it's like inviting Dan Quayle to a meeting. Right. You know, you just wouldn't do it, right?
Everything I know about, like most Americans, everything I know about Tony Blair, I learned from watching the movie Love Actually. So I'm just waiting for the naked guy to come out and sing. That's my whole,
absolutely right. Thing. But for some reason, they thought he might be a good voice around the table.
And what's interesting is Trump has changed the view of Gaza in such a huge way by talking about this idea that there is a future. That's the thing that people have always missed, the two-state solution. That there's no future because so we have another state that digs a bunch of tunnels and attacks Israel again. And so Trump has put out this idea of a future. And what's interesting to me is how sticky this idea has been, that people who are mainstream, and Tony Blair is definitely a mainstream politician. You know what I mean? He's not Nigel Farage on an edge. He's not Le Pen. He's not whatever. You know, he's right there in the middle. Sure. And the idea that he's engaging in this conversation about, well, let's look beyond the horizon to a future where you don't have nonstop warfare waged against Israel, where you have something else. I think that's interesting and compelling. And I think if you could find some other Tony Blairs around the world to enter this conversation, it'll cause more people to take it seriously. And the question is, but what do you do about the actual people in Gaza? That, of course, that's the final trump card.
Yeah. I mean, Blair, you know, for all of his faults, of which there are many, I mean, some argue he actually started a couple of wars in the Middle East. So what the hell's he doing around the table? Right. But nonetheless, you know, regardless of how contentious that specific point is, he was probably happiest in his skin when he was doing global things.
Right. And you also have, he's also an experienced hand at the war of Islamism. And you haven't talked about this a lot since the end of the Iraq war and Afghanistan. But, you know, remember, that was the fight from 2001 until whatever, you know, was it not Islam as a whole, not even close to Islam as a whole, but this, you know, hardcore group of people who had this view. And I think it surprised me how little the coverage of Gaza focuses on the fact that Hamas is an unapologetically Islamist group. They reject the kind of Islam that you see in Jordan and that you see in many parts of Egypt. They specifically say, no, it's got to be the, you know, this, you know, very narrow. There's a reason why Iran, which also holds this fringe view of Islam, you know, backs them. And so Tony Blair has been through that fight. And he's not going to be naive about it. I would argue that during much of the global war on terror, as it's called, the UK and America were intentionally obtuse about it. We just didn't want to admit that there was this religious component. You know, George W. Bush kept saying Islam is a religion of peace, which was demonstrably not true. Islam is a religion that many people practice in peace, that most people practice in peace, but definitely has room in its theological construct for this other more violent vision that other world religions at this point in history just don't share.
Yeah, it is indeed that. And Donald Trump, of course, has a lot resting on this, doesn't he? I mean, he's got Ukraine, but certainly what is happening with Israel and Gaza, this has got to be solved, and it's got to be solved fairly soon.
Well, particularly with the looming fear of the kind of violence in Gaza that no one wants to see as Israel pushes into Gaza City and the true stronghold of Hamas. And I don't know, I have to be honest, I'm watching this. First of all, the whole thing is intractable. When people say two-state solution, the answer is, another state to kill Israel. When people say you just have to get the hostages back, then, well, but that means that they'll be taking more hostages in the future because you made hostages more valuable. I don't see, this is such a Gordian knot. And I think Trump's theory is that his personality can be the blade that just cuts the knot, or that there's some fiscal, financial, like, isn't there a deal? I mean, look, that's Trump. Trump's a New York City developer. Yeah. Why can't we all just get rich? Is his answer. And the problem is that once again, Hamas and that vision, they're not interested in worldly happiness. They have another vision, and so let's just get rich. I don't know that that's going to be the solution.
Indeed. Well, we'll watch with interest, but I do sense that this has just got to happen at some level of speed now. Trump doesn't want this dragging on for another 2 years, right?
Oh, no, absolutely not. And Israel doesn't want it dragging along. And whenever Israel is in a shooting war, its support globally goes down. And then when the war ends and you get back to something like normality and all you have left are the whack job Islamists, conducting acts of terror, support for Israel goes back up, because war is ugly and people don't want to see it and it's hard to watch, and on and on and on. So everybody needs to compress the time frame. The question is there a two-front diplomatic, if you will, war going on against the holdouts in Hamas and their allies, which is on the one hand, Israel has their tanks rolling to the city. Sure. The other hand, you have people like Tony Blair, once again, not some fringe character, joining up with Donald Trump to put pressure on the other side. Isn't there a deal to be made? And so force plus the willingness for a deal, will that be enough to cause Hamas to finally get serious about a resolution?
While you're with us, Michael, we should get a word on what happened in Minneapolis yesterday, a horrific school shooting. We know that 17 injured, 2 young children died in this, and the perpetrator killed himself, as so often happens in these cases.
Yeah, and it's horrific, and I know that the UK has a hard time understanding how Americans are allowed to own the guns that we own. It was the issue of the gun culture is just hard to see, but to understand if you didn't grow up in it like we did. But we'll say that I think one of the elements of this horrible story that's good, well, two things. One is the media in the U.S. is taking a shellacking because they've worked so hard to mislead their consumers about what happened. The guy who committed this crime was a guy who identifies as a woman. The news outlets literally lied about it. CNN went on the air and lied about it because they didn't want to report the unpleasant facts.
Yes.
And that's not going to last. I mean, we're past those days. There's too many ways to get information. I know the BBC did some tweaking of some pronouns in some of their coverage as well. The second thing is people are now starting to make the point, as Democrats push back on President Trump's decision to send the National Guard into D.C., that this shooting is a typical weekend in Chicago right now, and that these large blue governed cities have a level of violence that, while they're right that crime has gone down year to year, they have a standing level of violence that most Americans just reject. And that's why a fascinating poll this week showed, I believe it was 81% of Americans supported the idea, because shocker, everybody, people like safety. They like being able to go out at night and not be scared. They like to know that when their daughter's on a date that she's going to be, going to come home. People want public safety. And when you look at this horror of this single morning in Minneapolis that's left us so shocked and grieving, and extrapolates that's a typical weekend in cities around the country, it just makes the case that there's too much tolerance for a level of violence and crime, and we need to develop more intolerance. And that's Trump's message. He's very simple-minded about it. Crime bad. Let's stop it.
Do you sense as well, Michael, and I've long wondered this, that school shootings have really become a kind of go-to display of sheer violence for the unhinged of a certain age? Right. It has a copycat nature to it.
Right,
you're going to go out. You're going to go out with a bang. I don't think this is to do with gun control at all. I think that's a red herring when anti-gun organisations and the like step up and say, look, this is what happens. Look, if you want to go nuts in a school, you'll find a gun somewhere. You'll find a knife somewhere. That's irrelevant. You'll still find it. But because it's seen as this kind of very high profile, the most lethal and dramatic way of going out with a notorious bang, I sense that's what happens here. And, there's a certain age correlation between those that carry out the crimes.
And the killer, 23, left behind a manifesto that he placed on YouTube, and then it got pulled down. But before did people spot? He actually has a line, something like, "I'm finally going to do this thing that I've had in the back of my head." He knew it was a suicide proposition, and it goes back to Columbine. Since Columbine, you've had this storyline, and you add the issue, the impact of social media on young people. This is such a new revolution. We don't know what it's doing to us. You add the increased isolation of people from community that really got a boost during COVID. Then you add this notion that there are people who can have these, clearly have mental challenges about who they are. And instead of like treating them or reaching out to them, you go, no, your completely untrue view is totally legit. You go, person. You add that all up together, and it appears to be a climate that generates the spike in the number of violent, mass shooting, violent crimes committed by people identified as trans. That story is going to be a story for a while, at least here in the U.S.
Indeed. And on a lighter note, when we talk about U.S. issues, we didn't even mention Taylor Swift, and long may that continue as well, Michael. I think we should try.
I am one of the few people, I don't even know. My wife was mocking me. She's like, "You must know one Taylor Swift song."
No.
And I finally remembered she does that "Shake It" thing, right? Isn't that her? Shake it off.
Yeah.
Isn't that her? Please tell me that's her.
That is definitely her.
It's not
even
old guy
I
music.
know
It's
that.
just right. Exactly. It's not that I only listen to old guy music. I listen to all kinds of music. I just don't. To her thing, whatever she does is not my thing.
Yeah.
That's it. But I listen to all the current stuff. Dean Martin and Tammy
Wynette.
Current. Isn't that?
Yeah,
you're chairman of the board.
Listen,
Old Blue Eyes.
You're the
Isn't
most relaxed man when a bit of Perry Como is playing in the parlour. I know this. Listen, great to have you with us, Michael. As ever, Michael Graham, our man in Washington on Capitol Hill, with the latest from over there, including that shock news that Tony Blair pitched up at the White House for a bit of a tete-a-tete with Donald Trump about solving the Gaza problem. Who'd have thought it?